Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll crack on. The title of of my talk this morning, "Total Strategic Failure," was considered. Ladies and gentlemen, since 2001, these have been the costs of the wars undertaken by NATO, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. At least that's $1 trillion, ladies and gentlemen, $1 trillion and counting. Now, those figures are derived from pretty credible sources. Harvard University initially came up with $3 trillion for Iraq. Now they're veering to $4 trillion, with the major cost, by the way, being looking after the wounded over a period of 30 to 40 years. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans killed and injured. Countless, actually, because nobody's counting, least of all us. And not least, over 7,000 NATO killed in action, the great majority of them American, about 10% of them British, and a couple of hundred other European and other countries. And for what? It was interesting to reflect yesterday on Mr. Atmar's talk, which, frankly, and are we not encouraged to be candid in this seminar, it was a talk we could have heard in the same terms 10 years ago, in exactly the same terms. And for what? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not my case here that the United States, the UK, NATO are responsible for all these deaths. It may well be that in the case of Iraq, we kicked the door down, set the house on fire, but other actors decided to treat the problem by pouring petrol on that fire and leaving NATO to deal with it. And by NATO I include, for the purposes of this talk, the United States. Equally, when I speak of total strategic failure, I speak of diplomatic, political failure primarily. Let nothing that's going to be said over the next 10 minutes leave you in any doubt that politicians are primarily responsible for this strategic disaster, the results of which we have been discussing over these last couple of days. However, I'm going to look for the next few minutes at one sliver of responsibility, one that's often ignored, and that's the military responsibility, and specifically military leadership. Now, General Bulger there, 3-star American general, wrote a book published in 2014, I think, called Why We Lost. Did well in America, and it's a very good book. In my view, one of the best histories of Iraq and Afghanistan. This man commanded at the divisional and corps level in Iraq, and he came up with this conclusion. Pretty blunt. I won't read it out to you in full. This was our war to lose, and by our he means the general officers, the senior military officers, and we did. The senior military leadership of NATO must bear their share, not the entire responsibility for this disaster. This dapper fellow here is a British equivalent, rather less trenchant, you might think. But even he, the former chief of the army, in fact chief of the defence staff in the United Kingdom, had something to say about amateurish approach to high-level military operations. General Richards, who now styles himself Lord Richards of Kandahar. Rather more bluntly, a more perhaps nuanced officer, Major General Mackay, who's arguably, by the way, for those who are interested, the most successful British commander in either war, said this. Pretty blunt, you might think. The level of incompetence is so great, and he's talking now of senior officers and occurring for so many years that it's systemic and has become cultural. General Bulger, I think, argues very much the same for US senior officers, and Petraeus, as we'll come on later, implies much the same in some of his work. Because ultimately, and things are of course much more complicated than this, NATO, and again I use the term as an umbrella term, were using 19th century military formations, and by the way some late 18th century military formations in the corps, essentially a Napoleonic innovation, divisions, brigades, and some 20th century ideas, armoured divisions, in campaigns designed around 1950s ideas of counterinsurgency, against a 21st century enemy that we've been hearing about only this morning, and indeed more extensively yesterday. And there's no excuse for this. There's no excuse, because every senior officer in here, I've no doubt, and certainly every senior officer in the Western military tradition, and I know India forms part of that, knows who the man on the left is, the dead Prussian Karl von Clausewitz. And so a bit of a busy quotation there, but what he's saying there is, understand your objectives and understand the kind of war you are going to be in. Now, in fairness to India, it seems to me that no one in his senses should start a war without being clear what kind of war he's going to fight, which, by the way, is part of that quotation. India's been pretty good at that. You've fought 4 limited wars with a rather dangerous opponent and have kept them limited. Britain, too, has a good tradition of that. When the Falklands War took place in 1982, we did not engage in a belligerent occupation of Argentina. The objectives were kept clear. And this is the keynote here, because this is what I'm talking about. Objectives. At what point, and this must have come out yesterday, implicitly in the address of Mr. Atmar and others, at what point was any true debate or discussion taking place as to what the parameters of the military operation was in either major campaign? Now, I've quoted here a very famous British general, the founder essentially of the current British intelligence system. He was, I think, one of General Slim's junior officers at one point in the 14th Indian Army, but he was appointed as Governor General during the insurgency in Malaya that some of you may have been familiar with. It's often touted as a British success, and it was. And before General, 4-star General Templar, was sent out in 1952, he asked his political leaders this question: what is it that I am required, what policy am I required to work to? The quotation is up there, I dug it out of the archives. What policy do you want me to work to, and what are my parameters? He wrote a very brief note to the Colonial Secretary, I won't go into the details, and more importantly, he got a reply. These are your parameters. I won't go into detail on what they were, but he worked to them, and the campaign, a complex, difficult, ethnically complicated insurgency, was resolved over a period of 8 years, quite successfully. So where are we with respect to Iraq and Afghanistan? We've had a look very briefly now at highly unclear objectives, at generalship that was unwilling to ask the right questions. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is the duty of very senior officers who sit at that interface between the global, the grand strategic and the military operational to ask that kind of question. But in order to ask that kind of question, there have to be the systems to back it up. Now, here we have a picture of ISAF headquarters, in fact, during the time when General Flynn, McChrystal, I should say, who was briefly quoted yesterday, was in command. You see him there on the back row. I use that picture to illustrate the complexity and the size of the operation supposedly informing the campaign in Afghanistan. This is just a small slice of the intelligence effort that went in. Behind each of those operators who are actually in theatre in Afghanistan, in that case in Kabul, there are hundreds, literally hundreds, of analysts and intelligence officers and other officials informing supposedly the operation. So what went wrong? With all these people, where was, I would ask, a synthesis? Now, Major Miller there was a Special Forces officer. He served in both theatres. He's quite a good writer. But he said, but despite all these resources, one thing we did not realise, that there are some very basic problems in either case of Iraq or Afghanistan. He would say, I would agree. First of all, essentially, to coin a phrase of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, you are not welcome. You need to understand that in the Islamic world, the invader is not welcome. You should keep your presence as light as possible and as brief as possible. This is Major Miller's take on that. But a more Eastern, someone from the Eastern military tradition has advice for us as well. Know yourself and know your enemy. You'll all know this, anyone who's been to military academy. Know yourself and know the enemy, and you need not fear defeat in 100 battles. It's a contention of the paper I'm going to produce, and indeed the several books that I've written, and it's a contention of today, that we knew and understood neither ourselves, neither our objectives, and especially we did not understand the enemy. And here I come back yesterday, if I might very briefly, to another comment. I didn't intend to do so, but it's an interesting gloss of Mr. Atmar, who declared that there's no difference between a good terrorist and a bad terrorist, and that may be right. But there was an assumption in that statement that the Taliban were all terrorists. Now, the question is, who are the Taliban? And that is a question we never answered, certainly the British, before we deployed in force to southern Afghanistan, because the answer is the Taliban were a relatively small portion of the enemies who were trying to kill us. We crashed into an area, and I include the Americans, in southern Afghanistan, to an area we didn't understand, dominated by narco trading, gangs, tribal rivalries, and to some extent with some influence of what the Pashtun call the Asli, the real Taliban, commanded by the Quetta Shura. We did not understand the enemy we were fighting in Afghanistan, Iraq. We can leave to another time. And in such a situation, as Sun Tzu said, you can expect defeat every time if you know neither yourself nor the enemy. So what? It's all very well admiring the problem. It's fun, isn't it, to conduct a hatchet job on our military command, especially if you're a junior officer or relatively junior like me. However, so what? What do we do about it? Just to conclude now, the last couple of slides, one suggestion, and I don't think I'm alone in this, is to begin to build into strategic culture now. I'm not talking about tactical culture. You can't, if you're told to take a position as a platoon commander, as a junior military commander, you can't go and say, well, actually, I think we should scope this one out because it's looking a bit dangerous. That's not going to work. You have to crack on and take the position. But at the strategic level, where you have that time, there has to be what I would call a red team culture, which is to say you need to have a component wound into your strategic planning, which is going to say, hang on a minute, have we looked properly at, for example, the nature of the enemy we are fighting in southern Afghanistan? This is another view. In business, they also call this black hatting. And the result of not doing so, of course, is you have a compliance culture, which is a massive topic, but it's evinced there by the major, a good friend of mine, who said we never had that operational honesty, we never had that critical approach. But someone who did is Dr. David Petraeus, US Army retired, who described, and it's not the prescription being advocated here, by the way, that everyone should do a PhD, but it is interesting that many of those involved currently in military transformation and in critiquing, including, by the way, General Bolger, in critiquing current military leadership, do have extensive academic training. And General Petraeus said that his academic training equipped him to be able to have success, as he did in Mosul, of all places, in the early days of the campaign in Iraq. And who else? Look who we've got here. General McMaster, PhD, University of North Carolina. The interesting thing about McMaster, who, as you will know, has been recently appointed National Security Advisor of the US, is that Dr. McMaster wrote an extremely controversial book, very much taking the same approach being taken today by me concerning the NATO campaigns in West Asia, and applying that far more sophisticated fashion, I might say, to Vietnam. And he called his book Dereliction of Duty. And many argue that it's that book, and having written that book, that delayed his promotion forward into the general officer's ranks. General Petraeus brought him forward. And it's the argument being made here that in complex conflict environments, such as those which face us now, we are in fact looking at a new great game. So those of you, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this program, that's Dr. Spock in Star Wars. That's wrong, Star Trek, what am I saying? Star Trek, good, you know it. And the game he's playing, those three-dimensional chess. And in order to play that kind of game today, if we can call it a game, I don't prefer not to do so, but let's say, we need to be prepared to be critical and properly equipped intellectually to deal with these complex problems. I'm going to leave you with two thoughts. The first, Professor Michael Howard, founder of the King's College War Studies, my own alma mater, Captain Howard M's Military Cross from Italy, arguably the most distinguished military academic of the last century, said, look, he said, the first battle may be the last in the next conflict. We need to be prepared for that kind of change, and if necessary to adjust, this is the important words in my mind, the alternative is disappearance and defeat. And the last thought I'm going to leave you with, I said there'd be two, is a son of India and a son of Britain. It's Rudyard Kipling, the British writer, said this: let us admit it fairly as a business people should. We've had no end of a lesson. It will do us no end of good. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. Happy to take questions.